So I wanted to talk about Romans. Steve Gregg's been on this, and he's on point on a lot of things. Other things I would disagree about. This was to have had my last video on this channel many moons ago, but uh, because of the course of things mentioned and otherwise, I wanted to do a couple more religious videos. So I want to talk about the beginning of Romans, but there are two Old Testament passages that I don't think should be overlooked when discussing the Old Testament. The first is from Genesis. Should not be neglected in discussing Romans. The first is from Genesis 15. And this is going to come really important. This is where Steve Gregg is in his discussion. And this is really where it's going to culminate to. Uh, I don't know if he really touched on it in the way I would have, but nonetheless, it really culminates in where he is, which is the end of chapter 3. And this is very important on the Romans road. On the Romans road, they wouldn't have a different opinion than I would have per se. I'd say such the same as Steve Gregg, that on the Romans road, they might say, all have sinned. You know, this conclusion, or the conclusion he comes to in chapter 3, I would say that's very much true, that all have sinned. You know, it's a very important conclusion, but there's a couple verses down, I think, is the more important conclusion from Romans 3, and I think it's one of the most important verses. Like, all of Paul's letters take the same kind of form, where it talks about kind of what he's against, and then what his doctrine is, and then how to live it out. And the Romans road might say, as Steve said, "Oh, all are under sin, and all have fallen short," and then they go to chapter 6, and then they go back to chapter 5, and I don't have a problem with that per se. Like, a lot of the arguments in the first four chapters of Romans are better ironed out in later chapters, and almost act like he's already proven those points earlier in chapters. But the point is so simple that, yeah, he did make the point in those chapters. It's just that we missed it. And Steve Gregg would say, "Oh, they came back from being scattered when Achaia and Priscilla had been scattered to other nations. They were allowed back under another administration." This is where Paul's making letters but it's like, you got to think his opponents weren't really who we would think his opponents would be. So, like, let's say people come back who are Jewish into Rome. Well, what are the chances that they have the same gospel that Paul's teaching? I would say probably not. Like, if they have Gentile audiences and they're experts on the law, and Paul's saying that they are teaching another gospel that's Judaizing and favoring the law and feast days and things like this. This is the same thing you see in all his letters. You would think, especially in Rome, where it's such a overwhelming Gentile population, that the few that came back were uh, talking about the certain things they know in the law, that they can teach the law and the prophets. That is, that they can teach these Christians. But Paul had already selected the best passages from the Old Testament, and he wasn't going to have these other teachers, these false teachers that want to boast in their circumcision, come and take over his church, these churches that he's formed. And when it comes to his point in Romans, I think that is very much glossed over, just like how a lot of the verses I was kind of alluding to earlier were in Colossians. This very important verse for ransom theory, I think it's verses 2 and 10. Uh, these substitutionary kind of views of what Jesus' atoning sacrifice mean are very short. Like, I'm saying this whole book of Romans, the most important book of all time, probably. So anything I think about the book of Romans, I'm going to probably grow in my understanding throughout time. And even watching Steve Gregg's videos, I've learned a lot about the book of Romans. But I wanted to point out a few other things because this book, I think, is central. All the things you find in the Gospels that Jesus said, I think you can find different versions in this book. It's a very deep book and yet very simple too. But yet, I think a lot of people don't understand it, and a lot of it's the Romans Road. So Romans Road and Calvinism have derived a lot of their knowledge from these chapters, and I would say I'd be much more agreed to Steve Gregg's view. Not necessarily that they would say, of course, the Jewish people have this promise and that promise. That he had to kind of surprise them. I think that is very much what the Bible does in the New Testament, saying from your point of view, to the enemy perspective. I don't think necessarily that's what was going on here. I think that it was a mostly Gentile audience, and he was writing, I think, mostly to Gentiles in light of these newest Jewish. So it's agreeing with Steve Gregg that in light of these new Jewish perspectives coming back to Rome, that I don't think that his audience was a Jewish audience. I think his audience was completely Gentile, but he often wrote to Jewish people, like, let's say we, because he's just saying, like, me and my race of people, my nation of people, my ethnicity, not necessarily yours, and it gets a little confusing there. But the book of Romans is so revolutionary that every word has multiple meanings. Like as Steve Gregg points out, not all Israel is Israel, so therefore Israel has two meanings in one sentence. And like in my Orthodox Study Bible, there's 5 defined meanings of the law in the study notes. 5 defined meanings of the law used in Romans. A pastor I listened to, I think his name is David Abbey out of Australia. He says there's 6 Israels, that he counted at least. And so it's hard to kind of just like think, oh, I know what this means because of the terms I use. And I'm going to get into that regarding Dr. Michael Brown's view of these words, because he often, he's talking about these kind of things. He goes back to the same verses all the time. It's just like, well, so Paul's saying, here in Romans 9, the Gentiles, and here in Romans 11, Israel. He's using these terms to mean a certain thing. And that's when he gets loud and everything. And so you think, oh yeah, Dr. Brown, an expert in all these things, he knows, but he's completely biased. And it shows ever more with what I can't talk about on YouTube and what's going on elsewhere in the world. Uh, that's why I won't even talk about Zechariah, because he talks about some things going down in that location that I'm just not on board with, and any dispensationalists I'll have to disagree with, because it's not has no place in the world other than in reality, which unfortunately, hopefully we can get some peace in the Middle East and everything. But uh, when it comes to the book of Romans and the culmination of all the verses, I think what we best do is look at the verse from uh, because it's talking about the sacrifice and stuff with when which made of Jesus and stuff like that, and this is the one that gets glossed over all the time. Romans 2:10, like how he was nailed to the cross as to take captivity no, it's not that. It was like he took the law and nailed it to the cross with when Satan, like this kind of Christ as the victor kind of idea of early in Colossians chapter 2. But what I think is the most important verse is this here is when it says uh, here, this is what's called on Wikipedia the most important promise. So not even talking about Genesis 12 or any other promise to Abraham. He's talking about, oh, I don't have the son, and just Eliezer of Damascus, who by the way is part of his household and part of the circumcision, but nonetheless, um, so just like Paul points out, he's going to point out in Romans 4 that in 3, also chapters 4, chapters 3, that he believed the Lord and was counted him as righteousness, which is also said about Romans or Genesis 12. But here in Romans or Genesis 15, it says, "And the Lord said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it?" So I think this is the most important verse. This is uh, Genesis 15 and 8. It says, "And he said, Lord God, whereby shall I know that I shall inherit it?" And it says, he said unto him, well, it's not as important as he believed the Lord and his kindness and righteousness. So this was the ultimate point that Paul's making in this whole section. And it says, take, so he says, he said unto him, take me a heifer of all these, he divided them, and he went through it. So this is proof to Abraham. This is how Abraham will know. So this is how the covenant had started, and this is how Abraham was to be, as Paul says, as a sign. It was a covenant. The circumcision and all that was a sign and a seal. But this is from God's showing forth to Abraham. This is God's righteousness showing forth to Abraham, which is his mercy. So he's saying, yeah, you don't have anything, but you're going to have all this in mercy. So it says, when there was a nation whom I should serve, a judge shall come out with great substance. There shall go forth their fathers in peace. There shall be buried in good old age. So although it has like these very physical components to it, it's not how you look at it. And I'd agree with Steve Gray that it all boils down to one line that eventually points to Jesus. That this faithfulness that Abraham's putting forth is not necessarily doing anything. You have all these other sons of Abraham, but only one is through whom this faith by faith covenant is going forth, that ultimately boils down to Jesus, and that's the end of that first covenant. So the second covenant is now from the Gentiles' perspective, where they say, how do I know? As Abraham said, well, how do I know? Well, this is God showing forth his righteousness. So that's his end of the bargain. He's giving it to people. And so I find it troubling that people with the kind of substitutionary atonement model of Calvin would kind of think that Jesus is our sacrifice. It's almost like from the perspective of Judas, it's like, oh, I know where he lives and I know how to get him, and I'm gonna. That's how they do a sheep. Oh, I know where sheep live. He's in my barn or on my field. I know how to sneak up on him. I know how to get him with the kiss, betray him with a kiss, and then I'll bring him to you, and then the Roman priest will offer him up to the sins of many of Israel's past sins or something. That although that is in scripture, as Caiaphas said, uh, for the sins of Israel that he'd be given. It's not even that for the past sins of Israel that I find differing with Romans. It's more so whom is owner of Jesus, and as his nation was ruled by despots, it might be those who exercised authority, like the high priest group who had their Sanhedrin building right next door to Herod's temple or castle and everything. But more so, the problem is that I don't believe that people could take God's precious lamb. The precious lamb that we get is, and we eat it, hopefully lives out a full life and everything, but usually not. Um, that's going to be, in its stage, we eat lots of lambs in a day. We'll give one to God. This is from our supply, but really God's the one who gave you the lamb. Everything you have comes from God, especially things that are born. It's like we have that ability to create life or anything. So this was considered through the Old Testament. So if you have a hyper Old Testament lens, you could say, oh, this has to be atoned for. Therefore, Jesus is that blood that atones, and with the blood magic, you get your result. But I'm here to kind of say something different. Is that I think that when Abraham gave his son, I don't think God tests or attempts, as James said, that when Abraham gave his son, he wasn't really doing that for God's sake. It was that this is a sign of what God would do for us, that we're supposed to get all these types, and a lot of times they're from different angles and they're hard to understand, but eventually we'll get to understand God's attributes. So the giving and the wanting to make a relationship with us, that is God's attribute, and the sacrifice, how we're supposed to give to God is a propitiation. Well, that's really, propitiation really has to do with the mercy seat, and the mercy seat of judgment to this world is given to Jesus, who experienced all the things, who was the servant of his apostles, the meek, the lowly. And so when it comes to the gift of Jesus to the world, it was really God that gave us Jesus to the world. And I would differ in Steve Gray by using the same words I did, because we often think of the Father as God and Jesus as the Son of God, but Jesus is not the Father God, but he is certainly God, so we can't say God did this and then Jesus. Well, that's confusing. So I need to be more clear. And I know Steve do that, and I wanted to type in, I'm like, no, I'd say the same thing, and I need to do better to explain how Jesus is God. And so, but Paul, I think, even does it too, because he says right here in Romans 1:18, for the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness. And I think he was talking about the Father even before Jesus came and had a part in these people's schema. I finally found my verse. I think it was Ephesians 1:18 or whatever it is, that it's through the mind's eyes in Hebrew and Greek and ancient, it was through the eye of the heart. So there's the same kind of thing I'm saying, is that these things happen in heaven, as much as on earth. And this is what Hebrews gets into, that as they go into the holiest of the holies, this is a type and a symbol for as God goes into the holiest in heaven with the sacrifice. And this is a much better propitiation. So on the judgment seat is Christ, and it's his blood. So this perfect lamb John saw in heaven. So these things are very cosmic. Even if they did happen on Earth, they're just reflecting the cosmic, overwhelming nature of these things happening. And so I wanted to go through these chapters in Romans, but like I said, there's one more important verse, and Paul actually quotes it. I think all the ones that Paul quotes, they're worth checking back. Sometimes I struggle with the way Paul interprets it. Sometimes I would go back and think, no, I would never, in my wildest, interpret it that way in the context. And for whatever reason, Paul does, um, and I don't know, but the one I wanted to go to is kind of towards the end of the book. It's in the minor prophets. So there's two things going on when the list of prophets. There's the categorization of minor and major. The major go first, and then it comes into somewhat a chronological order, and even the majors do chronological. But the minors also are in somewhat chronological, but um, also size order. So kind of competing size and chronology, and a little bit of, because they don't know when a lot of these were written, but they were probably stating this regardless of when it was written. They were probably stating this Habakkuk quite a lot, because this, as Paul was writing in the 50s, things were starting to heat up, especially in like Galilee and stuff like that, and it's about to be in Rome, or sorry, in Jerusalem. That if the Romans had sent a spy, they would know that people, out of all the books they could be reading this. And even though it was written a long time sooner, there's no proof that it was. But even if it was, it might have taken a much greater priority as people saw parallels in their everyday life. The name of this prophet almost sounds like from ancient times. It almost sounds like caveman name. It says Habakkuk, but in Hebrew, I think it's more like Chabakuku, Chabakuku. And when it comes to the book here, I highlighted some verses. So if I could just go through these highlights real quick, it says, "Because the wicked circumvent the just, I am raising up Chaldea, from himself derive his law." So I don't know if this is what Paul was talking about, but he will say this. He will say the Gentiles have a law of themselves, and it says their combined onset is that of a storm wind. I think when people talk about the storm wind here, when this is often talked about, then he veers like the wind and is gone. This has been talked about a lot in terms of war and also God. So it's easy to mix these ideas, especially when the Old Testament says God is a man of war, and all the stories are constant warfare throughout the books. But it says, "Why then do you gaze on the faithless in silence, while the wicked man devours one more just than himself?" And we know that the Chaldean Nebuchadnezzar wasn't necessarily the greatest guy. I think legend says his son went a little wicked, but the biblical narrative kind of says it was him. Not to split hairs, but I think it was Jeremiah who said that this is his sword. But uh, you know, some people say God is going to be concerned about every single hair on your head, but to be concerned about his holy land, his dwelling place, and his holy people, and his law, in the time of the old, uh, at this kind of point, you'd think that it would have to be so close to Hezekiah and Josiah and Asa and everything. It would have to be somewhat about the law and God's control and providence. I mean, the Deuteronomist is so influential. People today think that, oh, how much we're hated is how much we're not obeying the law, and this is largely from the Deuteronomist framework. And it says, so when you gaze upon the faithless in silence, it says, you have made man like the fish of the sea, like creeping things. So, God, like me, Habakkuk, I'm doing pretty good. But, like, there's so many Gentiles all over the place, and they're like running our city. And so, like, place like Genesis 14, I'm probably not telling a true story. This is probably the Judean sources going back to Genesis and interpolating something about this king of the north, that because you have these ideas like one king is the king of all the nations. This is true of Babylon. We have one king who's like the king of all the nations, the king of the north. And this is so you made all these people these creeping things. So it says, therefore he sacrifices his net and burns incense. A lot of verses won't render it that he burns incense. I don't know why, but that's just what it says here. So it seems like almost like Nebuchadnezzar is the fisher of men. He's scooping people up left and right. And it says, the rash man has no integrity, but the just man, because of his faith, shall live. So this is what Paul quotes here. So this is where we are in Romans, and Paul's, this is the highlight here. The just man, because of his faith, shall live. The faith here enables the virtuous man to survive an impending doom. So this has a lot to do with faith. Faith. So there's impending doom. The city's going to be destroyed soon. The prophet knows it. He laments, but he still has faith that, and so even Abraham had this faith that what he's doing, even though he had all these other sons, that wasn't what he was doing. It was this promise to him through this idea of faith. And so if he later comes along and gives a sign, it's not negating this faith-based promise that was going to carry on, that through all the nations shall be blessed. Let me show you what the church says about that. The Zionists will use this because this is what their religion is. The Zionist religion is, and this is also why Zionism is so big in the United States, because this is also what the religion is in the United States. So the Jewish people often is a term that they'll use, and this is a term that makes it's very ambiguous and eternal. That there's no continuity. That there's different generations. That there's different longitudinal segments throughout this time, but this is their belief. They won't necessarily practice Torah. They won't necessarily go and attend a certain thing on a certain day. They won't necessarily do anything that's written for them to do, but they will all commit to this. This is their faith. Their faith is that they're a personage that is getting this grace. So people have argued that this is what Paul is doing in Romans, is opening up this grace, this unmerited favor. Uh, but Paul isn't necessarily doing that. He's saying you kind of have forbidden away. He's kind of saying, like, not all who are of the circumcision are the circumcision. So he's not necessarily going with this idea of unmerited grace to just keep on sinning to mercy abound. He's kind of against that idea. But he does realize that this is a legitimate claim against his. So when this happens in the New Testament with Jesus, is often in a parallel and is often talking about a judge who's unfair. Well, God can't be unfair, but this is how the parallel goes. Whether it's this woman who wanted uh, the judge to hear her case, and she just kept on pleading and banging on his door at night, or whether it's a story of the unjust steward that called up everybody and said, "How much do you owe?" Well, I'll half that. I'll quarter that. Just make a deal. Storing up places for the world to come, much in terms of the dwelling places, friendships and things like that, and being shrewd for this world, and like Jesus said, you had to be shrewd as doves, and this is why I don't believe that Luke. Uh, this is how I can't believe that Luke took Matthew, and I can't believe that Matthew took Luke either, because some of these parallels in Luke, I don't know how Matthew could see those and choose against them. Just I don't think he was doctrinally that different, because and some of the stories in Luke that are just so wonderful. The two thieves and the road to Emmaus and all these. I mean, I can't imagine someone just seeing that and being like, "No, I don't need to include that. That's not important. Those are some of my favorite parts." But also, I can't see how somebody could take the stories of Matthew of Mary, Mark, John, and different people, Lazarus, and see their names and see their stories, and then just say, "No, those stories never happened, and those people don't really have import," and things like that. So they'd have to be almost independent in a way, or told to be separate. And they don't even tell the genealogies the same. But where were we? In terms of Genesis 12, it says here that the verse they often like to quote is, "I will bless those that bless you." And so it's talking to Abraham, but somehow they think you means them. Not to mention, like, they could not be related to them. They could also not practice, so they double disqualified. And thus, still, this is their belief. This is what their belief is. They don't even feel they have to do those things, and they don't feel they have to prove that they're related. This is their belief. They believe in this grace that's going to be bestowed to them because of their personage. And as John the Baptist and many people said, don't think that you have Abraham. And so Paul is going to take this idea of Abraham from them and give it to the Gentiles. And he's not stripping it from them per se, but he really is, because he does so in so many verses that he doesn't necessarily do so in every verse, but he does do so. And it says, "I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great, so you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and curse those that curse you." So here Abraham's gonna bless others, and all communities of the earth shall find blessing. So the way I see this is, like, Abraham has been the father of faith, that all people that say, "Oh, Abraham our father," like, we can do what the Jewish people do, and it's not necessarily stealing their identity, because Abraham did this by faith. He was the father of many nations by faith, as Paul says. So it's not replacement theology. This is Christian doctrine that Abraham is the father of many nations, as Paul says, through this faith. So as we believe in Abraham as our father, that he did these things, he left his Gentile parentage. We live our Gentile parentage. We say, oh, we reject what we learned from our fathers, and we want to follow the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And so we're no longer pagans. So Paul will say, don't be like the Gentiles to Gentiles. So Dr. Michael Brown doesn't understand these kind of things. He thinks that there's like some eternal race of people that have some eschatological purpose that's not even biblical. But he does this because he's supporting a nation in the Middle East and wants you to give your money to that. Paul did that, but it's not something we do today, because Paul he knew that a lot, James and people were like still posted up there, and he didn't want them to think that he didn't care about the actual temple there, even though he didn't. I mean, he knew the temple was going to be destroyed. He knew all that, I think. But listen to what the church says about it. It says, shall find blessing in you. The sense of the Hebrew expression is probably reflexive. Shall bless themselves through you. And in giving blessing, shall they say, many, or may you be blessed as Abraham, rather than passive. So Abraham's not going. When we bless Abraham, he doesn't bless us. It's like through Abraham will you be blessed. Like, so, hey brother, peace in Abraham to you, bro. You're good. You have faith. Peace in Abraham to you. Our father Abraham, bro. Peace to you. You got it. We're gonna get this one, And so, and when you bless Abraham, you say, Abraham had faith, fuck yeah, Abraham, he's the man. Then you're actually blessing your own self, because you're taking something God recognizes as being something he did, and you're faithful to that. You can say, yeah, I can be a Gentile and leave my former self and go where God tells me to. I'll do that. And then you're one of God's. You see, shall be blessed in you. Since the term is understood in the passive sense in the New Testament, it is in Acts 3, 25, Galatians 3, 8. It is rendered here by a neutral expression amidst both meanings. So also the blessing given to God to Isaac and Jacob. So this is the carrying on through the seed of Jacob, through the seed of Isaac, and you can go all the way back to Adam. You can go all the way forward to Jesus. It's a continual line. There's one Father, blah blah blah. It's not even genetic. It doesn't even do genetics, because all the people perceived Jesus to be genetically descended from Joseph, but he wasn't descended from Joseph whatsoever. So James, being descended from Joseph, is son of David. Jesus, being descended from David, is son of David. But the son of David is through his father's parentage, as it states in Matthew and Luke. And Jesus' father, it tells us, was actually when God came upon Mary, and she had not known a man. So that's who God, Jesus' father is. And so I really take issue with this Calvinistic idea. So it says the objective paradigm. I'm here on Wikipedia under the section relating to substitution atonement. While the idea of substitution atonement is present in nearly all atonement theories, some argue that the specific ideas of satisfaction and penal substitution are later developments by the Catholic Church and in Calvinism, respectively. So, satisfaction, Catholic Church, and penal substitution, Calvinism. Both Anselm's satisfaction theory and penal satisfaction theory hold that human beings cannot rightfully repay the debt to God's honor. So, I wanted to finish this Habakkuk because it talks about what I was going to say about creditors. So, what's going on here is that the Jewish people are being surrounded by the nations, and the nations are ruled by Nebuchadnezzar. And so, as he takes over a different nation, he takes the people he wants from those nations. Some he'll conscript. That's something the other people that say they're the people today, they won't do. They won't let people. They're worried about green on blue, and no. So when it comes to the nations, this is what they're talking about. It's saying this is about faith. It's like saying all I have is hope. You're going to destroy this. We're over here eating our sandals and some other ungodly things that uh, we this is terrible. We're full of lamentations, and the enemies surrounding us. They're worse than we are. Like, what's going on here? How's this fair? And a lot of this is retrospective. A lot of this comes from post-Babylonian people thinking, well, how to explain disfavor, and this is why it's like, oh, adherence to the law and everything. And we have the Bible here in Habakkuk 2, it says, "Shall not your creditors rise suddenly? Shall not your credit?" This is 2:7. Shall not your creditors rise suddenly? So the creditors are the Jewish people in Jerusalem. They're the creditors because they have their farms around there pillaged, and they're not getting compensation for it. So it says, because of men's violence done, woe to him who perceives evil. So what you're doing over there is evil. So when the Romans were all coming up on them and not letting them do what they want to do, they're probably reading this. They're probably like, this is ridiculous. This is taxation without representation. This is unjust. This is ungodly. How could this happen? Woe to him who perceives evil. So this is what they think of the Romans. Woe to him who perceives evil. For the stone of the wall shall cry out. So this is like, if you think that we're dead and we don't even matter, and you're gonna go in your palace, like even the stones will cry out. But this is what Jesus saying to Jerusalem is like, you go ahead and kill all these people that you think don't believe how your leader believes, like Jesus even himself. Oh, I don't wash my hands or whatever it is, like, kill me, why don't you, and they did. And it says so that's how like a lot of predators will see. I think the judgment fall on Jerusalem is like, you're looking at it all wrong. Like a lot of the Hebrew Israelites will be like, oh, I can't believe they killed Jesus and then destroyed our city. We're gonna get them. It's like, no, you gotta understand it from God's perspective, that the enemies of God became the friends of God became the enemies of God through the new covenant. Because what was the old covenant? It was like, oh, you just have to be a light to these other nations to show them righteousness and stuff like that. And so it's like, well, they weren't even doing that. It's like they were being unrighteous, as Paul says, and I'll show you. It says, "But the end of the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of the Lord's glory, as the water covers seas." This is the purpose of Israel. This was what it was all for. This is what the promise was all for. So Jesus is that light. Jesus is, and Paul too, because Paul filled what Jesus lacked, he said. And not that Jesus was lacking anything, but his ministry lacked. So Paul went to the Gentiles more so even than to his own people. Maybe not at first, but eventually that's where, by the time he started to write his letters, people could say that about him. And he wouldn't deny it. Um, so it says, "Woe to you who give your neighbors a flood of your wrath and make them drunk in nakedness." So make them drunk in their nakedness scene. Remember, this goes way back, all the way to Noah and everything. Make them drunk in their nakedness scene. So this is probably what, yeah, probably because when we take parallels of the firstborn, like Reuben and things like this, uh, we and you know how Absalom slept with David's concubines. This is like taking life from in a Hebrew idiom. Like I think it was like Abishai accused Joab or whatever it was that, oh, you just want to lie with the kings. He's like, what am I, a dog's head? Somewhere in Samuel or something like Second Samuel, but this is like basically death on them in their culture, and so when they says he saw his nakedness, I mean, I would think it would have something to do with like ruining his life or something more than some sort of weird particular act. But so you are filled with shame instead of glory. Drink you to and stagger. You shall revert the cup. And this cup, we see this talked about a lot. I think in Jeremiah, maybe Ezekiel, for the violence done to your Lebanon. Uh, for the violence done to Lebanon shall cover you. So they're almost like picking sides. It's like, Hiram, up in Tyre, he used to give 606 talents of gold to Solomon. So Solomon was kind of the king of nations back then, and like, yeah, it is what it is. And because of men's bloodshed and violence down the land, into the city and all who dwell in it, they make them idols. But see that when it comes to all the nations should be filled with the knowledge of God's glory, look how by the end of this chapter they're talking about idols and stuff. We as Gentiles, we took Jupiter and turned him into, I heard the other day, Jupiter. And so they already had the statue of Jupiter. So they just had to repurpose it to be Jupiter. And when doing so, these aren't gods, these are men. So they're not worshiping them because they worship the God of Israel. All of a sudden they're not committing any sin. So they're not a bad person. They're not unrighteous because they got a statue of Peter. I mean, a lot of the Protestants would say otherwise, but I don't think that's how it was for the first 1,500 years of Christianity. And the change, I think, came largely out of the Netherlands, out of all places. But yeah, Israel didn't gets redeemed, and all the prophecy and stuff like that. So like I said, that there's a certain model to Paul's letters, a certain model to all the prophets. It's like, yeah, we're getting trashed, but here's the resurrection, then glorious times. And people often, dispensationalist Hebrew Israelites often say, well, I don't remember the good times. I just remember bad times. So therefore God's a liar. But God can't be a liar. because he said he's not. And because he said he's not, and I don't have anything to base my foundation on other than scripture, therefore it's going to come true. Even though it says in the Torah that things a prophet, if it doesn't come true, is not a prophet. But I do have hope that things can have come true that haven't come true for people as long as they don't hurt others. And as a pastor that I think is right about a lot of things, he says, hope deferred is not hope denied. So I too hope for this hope that Habakkuk, if he's so unhappy, I hope things work out for him as long as no one else is hurt. That's the problem with a lot of these things. It seems like someone else is going to be hurt. It's like, oh, we're going to be sitting under a tree like a Fendi while these people are carrying us and, plowing and things like that. It says, for through the fig tree blossom not, nor fruit be on the vines, though the yield of the olive fail, and the terraces produce no nourishment. Well, it's kind of opposite of what Jesus is saying. Jesus is saying, if I want a fig, where's the fig? But they're basically saying, we can't have any figs. We're under siege. So I don't know. I have sympathy if they're under siege, I guess. But I don't know how Jesus would do them like that if it was supposed to be some sort of parallel. But yeah, I think this is very much the climate of where Paul's coming from. This is probably the sentiment of a lot of people at that time. And that's where I'll start into Romans. It says, the gospel of God. These are highlighted verses. So to get through it faster, I highlighted the parts. It says, the gospel of God, which he promised before. The gospel of God, which he promised before. And just as when Jesus said, John wrote a letter from prison. Are you him? He's like, oh, the lame leap, the blind see. Like, this is the gospel. The gospel is here. The kingdom has started. If you'll have it. So it says, which he promised before concerning his son, Jesus Christ. So all these promises were about Jesus Christ. So it says declared to be the son of. So he's declared to be the son. So his resurrection says declared to be the son, spirit of holiness by the resurrection from the dead. So his resurrection declared his holiness. He's a life-giving spirit. He's has no end. He's alive and won't die. He's divine. Through him we have received grace and apostleship for obedience to faith among all nations. So his mission through the Messiah coming, as Isaiah said, is to teach obedience by faith to all the nations. So he's saying, my view of what the light was through Torah that I was studied my whole life to know is that I'm supposed to go out and teach these nations that the Messiah has come and that through faith that I'll be justified. I mean, this is amazing. So I want to jump forward, but real briefly. Now, I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often plan to come to you. This is an aside. This is not one of the things I wanted to highlight, but this is kind of important to know the context. That just like in Thessalonians, 1 Thessalonians chapter 2, verses 8 through 16, that these are who Paul's enemies are. These are the law keepers, the people that would take his churches and say, hey, I know all this kind of stuff, then try to take his flock and lead them astray. So these are Paul's opponents in all his letters, the same kind of people, kind of the sons of Sceva types. So it says, Now I do not want you to be unaware, brethren, that I often planned to come to you, but was hindered until now. We know who's hindering him. We know who's arresting him. We know who's causing up fuss in the people in the marketplace. Just go read through Acts. It's clear. That it might have some fruit among you also, just as among the other Gentiles. So he's saying, I haven't been in Rome. Maybe Peter has, but I haven't been here. I wanted to come for a long time. I'm a debtor to the Greeks, so he's just out of nowhere. It's just like, listen, I learned from all people: Greek, barbarian, Jew, Scythian. I don't care. Like I learned from all kinds of people. I'm kind of like that too. I'll go to like Indian food and I'll be like, oh, what's this? What's this? What's this? It's like I just want to know that kind of stuff. It says, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith. So all the things with Abraham and the law and all this was trying to do is to make a people who the next generation would have faith, and then the next generation would have faith, and they could eventually take this light and pass it on to all nations, and all nations will have faith. And that's what's gonna save them. So all the law was nothing but a seal and a sign of the fact that they have this faith. But the faith was what gave them the grace. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all unrighteousness and all who suppress the truth. So the way Steve Gregg says it is like, oh, it's kind of sneak up to you. You think he's talking about the Gentiles when he's actually talking about Israel. I very much agree, but I almost think that there's almost like this spirit in the air that there was maybe anti-Semitism in Rome, and Paul was like knew his crowd was anti-Semites, so he wrote to them, and they just picked up on something we missed, and I missed until very recently. That when he talks about those that suppress the truth and the righteousness, he's not talking about the Gentiles. I'm serious. So as Steve Gregg says, it kind of makes you think you would be thinking that, but no, not at all. Like that's not like, yeah, Steve Gregg's right. Like maybe he would have you think that's what he meant, but really it's more like obvious. It's like, hey, you Gentiles, they keep on saying that we're against unrighteousness. Well, they're unrighteous, and they're like, yeah. So like it was more obvious to them, but we miss it because it's not our culture to hear those kind of things. It's not where we are mentally. So there's because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for shown to them. So they have manifest God. They have so-called faith in God. They don't even have to be Jewish. Whether you're Jewish or not Jewish, you still have revealed from the universe through things around you, through creation, knowledge that God exists. It's self-evident in creation, in your own being, that there's a creator and a love for God, sustainer. And so that's going to be manifested in you. And for since the creation of the world, I mean, even before there was a law, even before there was Abraham, there was still this right. There's Noah, there was Cain and Abel, there was righteousness before there was ever law. This is also is evident in reason. It's evident in scripture. It's just self-evident even. Corruptible man, because they have faith, it doesn't mean they're not corruptible. All man is corruptible. So this is what he's saying. He's saying corruptible man, he went to the lust of his own heart. He turned God into these four-footed things. Well, they would say, "Oh, John, there. See, that's why it's Gentiles." And that's what I thought too. But you got to understand this: that there are the four heavenly creatures in heaven. There are Ezekiel's vision. There's different Ezekiel, the hawk, the eagle, and the lion, and these things like that. But also, it doesn't matter. And there's pagans through Israel's history, and so really, it's not just because like you didn't have idols. Even though you can go back and look at caskets from that time, and they'll have Hebrew on them, and they'll have pictures of idols, but it's you it's not like we've now made it like I think big beef, and the biggest beef is like those extremists in the Middle East that tear down these buildings and stuff from ancient Babylonian and Persian times, saying, "Oh, it's for Islamic cause," and these iconoclasts. This was big in Luther's term, but like I said, they turned statues of Jupiter that were ancient into Jupiter now they're all of a sudden taking down these ancient relics, and it's really terrible. But when it comes to Romans 1, you gotta understand this. Like I was saying about Luke, they have these great parallels. Well, one of these parallels is the Pharisee and the publican. Well, I first heard about this, not even in the Bible, from what I recall, was from this guy called Osho, who was out in Oregon, this Indian spiritual leader, and he had talked about in terms of the prostitute and the priest. And so the prostitute would say, "Oh, I'm such a sinner, I'm such a sinner." Well, think of the sinful woman, who dried her tears with her hair on Jesus' feet, cleaning them, like, and then the Pharisee who says, "Oh, I'm holier than thou, and I make my fringes long, and I'm loud with my written prayers," and like, so these Jewish people, Paul's going to say, they do these things. They might not make a temple, they might not make idols, but they do rob God, as Malachi said, or in a different way. I think Steve Gregg pointed to like historical example or something, but you don't have to look at proof. You just got to know, like, anybody's going to do this. Jesus said they did it. Jesus said, "Oh, Corbin, don't be talking about Corbin. You could have given that furniture to your grandma, but you gave it to the priest and burned it. Now it's sacred. Ooh, what good is that going to do?" And so, and even if they weren't like, oh, committing adultery, committing homosexuality, this and that. Well, if they were thinking of it, if they were, kind of simulating it and getting close to it, it depends where the heart is at. And that's what Jesus said is like, if you have hate in your heart, you already committed violence. I mean, it's like you have a violent heart. That's the problem. And so it's kind of against their idea of what makes them good. It's like, listen, you that have the law, you have to keep everything of the law, and you don't. You are a sinner. So even though it seems like it's about Gentiles, I would almost agree with Steve Gregg. Like this is against this is a certain diatribe against a certain group of people that thought they were better than everybody else, because they could too be backbiters, haters of gods, violent, proud, boasters, inventors of evil things, disobedient to parents, undiscerning, untrustworthy, unloving, unforgiving, unmerciful, who knowing the righteousness of God. Well, who's that? You don't think just because they have the law, they're somehow exempt from all these petty things people do every day that just, oh, Susie's a loser, but don't tell her I said so. You know, like, people just are people, regardless if they have the law or not. They're going to do these things that are sinful. They're not helping anybody. They cause destruction, but they're minor, you know. Well, Paul's just saying there's no minor about it. You who have the law. It says right here, verse 32, who knowing the righteousness judgment of God. Well, I'm not saying this is only Jewish people, because as Paul said, these things are evident outside of the law. That God exists is evident, and we can know certain things about him just by existing. His loving good nature and things just from experiencing it. So knowing the righteous judgment of God, that those who practice such things are deserving of death. So even the bad side of that coin, not only do the same, but also approve of those who practice them. Therefore, you are inexcusable, whoever you are, who judge. So Jesus said, how you judge others, you'll be judged yourself. For in whatever you judge another, you condemn yourself. So, and you who judge those practicing such things are doing the same. So if you're saying, oh, you nasty, nasty boy, you nasty wolfy, froggy, toad, you subspecies don't have the law. You worship all kinds of mules and who knows what. And we who have the law, knowing the righteousness of God, his goodness and forbearance, like, we think you're nasty. He hasn't judged me because he doesn't need to. I'm perfect. Well, turns out you're not perfect, and he hasn't judged you because he's long suffering and forbearing and merciful. So when you say you're nasty, you should be judged. Well, why should you be judged? Because of this arbitrary law of Moses that, oh, these things don't make you better or worse, they just make you different. And the people you're different from weren't even told to do it and maybe didn't even know about it. And all of a sudden that makes them nasty and brutish. Well, you circumcise yourself to say, I do all these list of things, and then you don't do these list of things. So couldn't somebody come along and say, you're nasty and brutish then? Not that they would, but if you're pointing fingers around, you're kind of asking for it. But in accordance with your hardness and impotent heart, treasuring up wrath. This is just like Paul was saying of, and Jesus saying in Matthew 23, Paul in 1 Thessalonians, the storing up wrath. You're just coals on yourself, lumping coals on yourself. So it says eternal life to those who seek glory and honor. So if you have this idea that I believe in God, I believe he's going to do what he said he does. He promised he'd give us mercy. He promised us eternal life. I believe in it. And because you believe in it, you do good. And you live your life accordingly, following him, getting in a relationship with him. Then this is going to be the eternal life. Not those that say, oh, Abraham's my father, so I just do what I'm told, and I got circumcised on the 8th day. I didn't even choose to. And I just have these blessed securities, or like a Calvinist. Well, he chose me, so I have these blessed securities. It's like, no, you got to have a contrite heart, and you got to try every day and become a better person and struggle and realize that you need some humility. But to those who are self-seeking and do not obey the truth, but obey unrighteousness. So it says right here, they obey unrighteousness. So for them, indignation and wrath. To them first. because they had the law first. If you want to be first, how about first up to this line? How about that? Because God's righteous judgment is what's at stake. And if he's just giving around cookies, regardless of who's been a good boy, just because, oh, I promised I'd give you a cookie. No, I promised I'd give you a cookie if you're a good boy. And if you're not a good boy, you don't get a cookie. So, and I'm not saying it's by works. No, this, how you be a good boy is by being part of his family. And how you be part of family is by faith that you're part of his family. And when you have this faith, when your consciousness will convict you. If you wouldn't want to do this to somebody else, you wouldn't have it done to you. This is the golden rule. And the West has been built around this. People that don't do like this are an anathema. They are criminals. So you got to realize that you don't want to be judged, so you don't go around judging people. So, as many have sinned without the law will also perish with the law. But guess what? So if many have sinned with the law, will perish with the law. Or then they'll be judged by law. Jesus said Moses will judge you. And Lazarus goes down up to have his Lazarus, Luke, Abraham's bosom, rich man. There to have Moses. Moses will judge you. If you want to say, you don't do this by Moses, you don't do this by Moses, you eat pork, you eat shellfish, blah, blah, blah. Well, Moses will judge you then because you're going to judge by Moses. It's not those who hear the law. It's those that do the law. And when the Gentiles who do not have the law, by nature, that's because God is already revealed in the normal things. Jews aren't the only people that can see God. God's revealed in nature. They don't have the law. Do the things that are in the law. Not having a law are a law in themselves. Are a law in themselves. Who show the work of the law written in their hearts. Their conscience bearing witness. You're called a Jew and rest on the law. You're sleeping on it. You rest on the law and can make your boast in God. Oh, I have Abraham. You said your father's the devil. Come on. And it says, and are confident that you yourselves are a guide to the blind, a light. You're supposed to be a light to the Gentiles. So why are you teaching them to have faith that they're saved in Jesus Christ? You're teaching them they got to obey the 7 Noahide laws. Do you dishonor God through breaking the law? You're not going to tell me the Gentiles are the only ones committing adultery. It somehow escapes your nation completely. You're not going to tell me that. But if you are a breaker of the law, then you're basically a Gentile. That's what it means in your view. We're the people that keep the law. Well, you're not keeping the law. So what's that make you? If an uncircumcised man keeps the righteousness requirements of the law, will not his circumcision be counted as circumcision? So it says even he will judge you. Remember how Jesus said that you sit on 12 thrones, judging? So it says people, he's not Jews one outwardly. People find this like to mean, well, you have to be blood and religion. No, it's saying it's not based on blood at all. It's not based on your ethnicity, your culture, your circumcision. No, it's not based on that at all. Which means that not only can you be excluded for not having the righteous faith required, but you can also be from the outside included. That's what people have struggled. People like Dr. Brown struggle with that. they won't even admit that. They'll say, "Oh, I got to be different than you. You can't be like me." The Jew to them were committed the oracles of God. So that's the benefit. So that is a good benefit to have. If you have a head start to you first, you were given the benefit. So yeah, is what benefit is there? Bozo, you got the whole friggin' book. So what do you mean what benefit? If I can be better and have the world to come all to myself and keep those slime out of here there, then I don't get my special little cookie. Well, like if Gentiles got a cookie too, does that mean you don't get a cookie? No, it doesn't mean that. So for what if this is based on exclusivity? Exclusivity. You try to make things more valuable. You have a country club. Well, the more people we exclude from the country club, the more people will pay for their memberships. This is a money making thing. This is an elitist kind of thing. It's not based on reality. It's not based on good moral sense. For what if some didn't believe? Well, this so let's say oh, I was born Jewish and I decide to not believe. I'm an atheist Jewish person. Does this mean God has failed? God's not going to keep his end of the bargain? No, it means you didn't keep your end of the bargain. It's always been about this covenant. So this promise was by covenant. This seal later on, him sacrificing his son and stuff like this. This was or attempting to. This was just to show that he's in the covenant. This is just different ways of pledging and confirming and stuff like that. This isn't making or breaking the covenant. This is what am I saying? Okay, but if our righteousness demonstrates the righteousness of God, but if our unrighteousness demonstrates the righteousness, what you said, is God unjust if he inflicts wrath? So if I'm lying and saying, oh, it's only for this special people because God said it, I'm really doing God a favor. It's like, no, because you're lying. And if God wants to show how he made a people and blessed some and cursed others to demonstrate his wrath, this is his purview. If he wanted to have vessels of wrath and vessels of righteousness, if he wanted to say, oh, I set your people over to be a demonstration to the world in front of everybody, and I have this rule and some didn't follow you, when I kick you off the island, is this showing my unrighteousness? No, this is showing my righteousness. This is showing that when I said these are the rules, this is what you're going to do. And the rules is to live by faith, to let him lead. And so when it says, what then, are we better than they? Not at all. So he's saying, as a Jewish person writing to all these Gentiles, what are we Jewish people better than Gentiles? No, because both Jewish and Greeks are all under sin. So Paul ends up quoting Psalm 14, but he skips the first verse for some reason. And the first verse can sum up. He ends up making the quote of the entire chapter. Maybe that's like how sure he was of his point. Like, if anybody goes and reads this, then and they see what I just did, that's smooth. Like I could have just did it all, but I kind of had a little bit of tact and grace for those that want to be on the road to Emmaus and feel that moment of discovery. Like, I waited patiently for the Lord, and he inclined to me and heard my cry. I'm in the wrong verse. Sorry. The fool has said in his heart, "There is no God." They are corrupt. They have done abominable works. There is no one that does good. Oh, he did include a little bit of it. Last sentence. But it's like, well, if he's talking about enemies, it's hard to understand who this is because at certain times there were Paul had David had lots of enemies, and twice in his life, the people that were against him were actually Israel. So, is he talking about Gentiles? Is he talking about Israel? It's kind of hard to say, and it's also kind of hard to believe this is actually something David wrote because he talks about the Babylonian captivity being over, and so it's kind of a weird chapter to begin with. So I don't want to dwell too long on it. It says, under the law, everyone's guilty before God, for the law is the knowledge of sin. But now the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. So it says the righteousness of God apart from the law is revealed. So Jesus came and he's saying, "Oh, you don't have to do this and you don't have to do this. What you really need to do is focus on this kind of new covenant being established, and this is it has not to do with the law. This is a righteousness apart from the law." It says here, chapter 3, verse 21. Whom God set forth as a propitiation. So this is what I'm saying is the most important verse. People say it's verse 23, for all sin and fallen short of the glory of God. This kind of Romans Road kind of first verse of a few they use. But I think the most important verse is this: whom God set forth as a propitiation by his blood through faith to demonstrate his righteousness, because in his forbearance God had passed over the sins that were previously committed. So people kind of think it's like, oh, if I snatch up Jesus, like you do a lamb, put a muzzle around his head, throw him in the back of the truck, and take him down to the butcher, then I've given up Jesus. He was part of my livestock, and it's kind of just like a weird view that I don't really hold to. The Old Testament says clearly that sins have to be atoned for. So Jesus, the human being, is somehow atoned. No, I think that these older symbols were types and shadows, so we can see God's work. What is God doing? So God has, through His blood, through our faith to His blood, demonstrated His righteousness, because in His forbearance. So it shows God's character. Paul has said many times, and this is true throughout the Old Testament. This is what you could get out of the Old Testament, if you would, that about this constant hope and forbearance and grace and favoritism and unmerited mercy. So he points to like David, how David was like, oh, I'm so much happier when touch not my anointed is going on, when um when my dad doesn't whip me, I like it a lot better. Oh, I hope my dad doesn't catch me. I hope my dad doesn't catch me. Oh, I'm so glad you're in a good mood, Dad. Oh, thanks for not being mad, Dad. Like that's the contrite heart, but it's also a great blessing of grace. A great blessing of grace would be whose sins are not looked upon. And he might be the. So I think this is very much. I was going to read this. So let me just say this. I'm about done. I'm getting tired. Let me read this little bit from Wikipedia, and I'll change the video from Romans 1 through 3. I'll be at the same point Steve Gregg is, and then I'll try to pick it up from there. I never got to finish this Wikipedia, so yeah. And then by the time I get to the most important verse, I'm tired. So yeah, verse 325, and of God's offering to maybe to appease Satan, to make Satan think, oh, I'm getting the Son of God. Maybe that kind of propitiation, but it's not like God is like, oh, I hate you people. Oh yes, give me my son's blood. No, you people are okay. No, it's like God in his tears and begrudgingly out of love gave his only son for you. It's so much more beautiful that way. Instead of we gave him, Jesus was never ours to give. So I wanted to read these things real quick. I started to read off of Calvinism, but I'm doing better than Steve Gregg. I haven't said it's better in terms of words, but he's on he's on video 9, so he's got like 9 hours or something to be this far into Romans. And I don't think he went as far into Habakkuk or other things as I have, but he definitely said a lot of good stuff. I'd definitely encourage people to read through that. But and some satisfaction theory and penal satisfaction. So it's not um the old Catholic Church satisfaction theory or penal substitution. It's penal satisfaction holds. So this is something more like I would ascribe to, contrary to these other things, mostly held by the Calvinists. Penal satisfaction theory hold that human beings cannot rightfully repay the debt to God's honor or God's justice, which was incurred through their willful disobedience of God, since only God can make the satisfaction necessary to repay it, rather than merely forgiving humanity. So only God can make the satisfaction. God sent God man, Jesus Christ, to fulfill these conditions. Christ is a sacrifice by God on behalf of humanity, taking humanity's debt for sin upon himself and propitiating God's wrath. The penal substitution theory has been rejected. So this isn't what I ascribe to. I ascribe to the penal satisfaction, but the penal substitution, the more Calvinist view, has been rejected by liberal Christians as unbiblical and an offense to the love of God. According to Richard, these theories are based on retributive justice rather than restorative justice that the prophets Jesus taught. So like on jail, I wouldn't say rehabilitation center, would say um, uh, penal center or something. So it says also there's government theory, which sounds okay. It says states that Christ suffered for humanity so that God could forgive without punishing them while still maintaining divine justice. Jesus' death demonstrates God's hatred of sin. Thus, God's law, his rule, his government is upheld. People that sin is serious. So when people sin, it's serious, and the God's rule is upheld. So that's what Paul's getting into, is God's righteousness and justice and everything. The government theory rejects the notion of penal substitution. That's that Calvinist one I was talking about, but still substitutionary in itself, in that Christ and his exemplary sufferings substituted for believers the punishment they would otherwise receive. I don't know. I mean, so I'll pick it up on Romans 4. I'm going to sign up here immediately. I don't have time anymore. This is already an hour and a half in. All right. Peace.